Look closely at this 100-year-old photograph. At first glance, it's a standard Victorian-era portrait. A father, a mother, 3 children, motionless. But if you shift your gaze to the shadowy corner behind the father's shoulder, there is a 6th face. And no one in that room ever saw him enter. In October of 1924, photography was not the instantaneous impulse it is today. It was an event. A solemn, expensive ritual reserved for life's most pivotal milestones, marriages, anniversaries, or the rare occasions when scattered family members gathered under one roof. The Miller family had assembled at their secluded farmhouse on the outskirts of Blackwood Creek. The occasion was the golden anniversary of Arthur and Margaret Miller, 2 homesteaders who had carved a harsh life out of the unforgiving timberlands. The day was heavy with the oppressive chill of impending winter. To mark the milestone, Arthur had hired a traveling photographer named Thomas Vance, a man known throughout the county for his painstaking attention to detail and his heavy, wooden view camera. Setting up for a photograph in the 1920s required immense patience. The parlor had to be meticulously arranged. Because the glass plate negatives of the era demanded long exposure times, subjects were required to sit completely still for several seconds, sometimes up to 15 seconds under dim interior light. Any movement, even a subtle twitch or a heavy breath, would result in a ruined, ghostly blur. Thomas Vance spent nearly 45 minutes framing the family. Arthur sat stoically in a high-backed wooden chair, his hands resting heavily on his knees. Margaret stood beside him, her spine straight, wearing her dark Sunday dress. Surrounding them were their 3 adult children, Clara, Edward, and Samuel. The blinds were drawn open to catch the pale afternoon light filtering through the heavy curtains. Vance checked his composition multiple times beneath the black velvet drape. The room was dead silent, save for the rhythmic, metallic ticking of a tall grandfather clock in the hallway. "Hold still now," Vance instructed, his voice muffled beneath the dark cloth. "Not a breath. Keep your eyes on the lens." He inserted the glass plate holder, pulled the dark slide, and squeezed the rubber bulb to open the shutter. For 12 long, agonizing seconds, the room froze. 5 people sat suspended in time, holding their breath, staring directly into the dark glass eye of the camera. Click. The shutter closed. The session was over. Vance carefully packed his glass plates into light-tight wooden boxes, collected his fee, and began the long journey back to his downtown studio. The Millers returned to their quiet evening, entirely oblivious to what had just been etched into silver and glass. 3 days later, in the claustrophobic red glow of his darkroom, Thomas Vance began developing the afternoon's glass negatives. He submerged the plate into a chemical bath of developer, rocking the tray gently back and forth. Under the amber safe light, the invisible image slowly began to bloom. First came the stark white of Margaret's high collar. Then the sharp outlines of the Victorian furniture, followed by the stern, weathered features of Arthur Miller. Everything was remarkably crisp. Vance smiled, pleased with the clarity of the exposure. But as the background shadows deepened into rich tones of dark gray and black, Vance noticed something deeply unsettling in the narrow space between Arthur's right shoulder and the solid wood wall behind him. At first, he assumed it was a chemical flaw, an air bubble in the gelatin or an improper wash. He leaned closer to the tray, his heart taking an odd, uneven leap. The shadow wasn't a stain. It was developing into a distinct, undeniable human form. Emerging from the pitch-black corner behind the patriarch was a face. It was impossibly pale, leaning forward as if peering directly over Arthur's shoulder. The eyes were wide, unblinking, and sunken deep into hollow sockets. But what sent a jolt of ice through Vance's blood was the expression, a wide, unnatural, static grin that stretched across the man's lower jaw, revealing dark, ruined teeth. Vance pulled the glass plate out of the chemical bath with trembling hands and held it up to the safe light. The figure was standing directly inside the room, mere inches behind Arthur Miller's head. Yet Vance remembered the setup perfectly. He had stared through the viewfinder for nearly an hour. The wall behind Arthur was solid tongue-and-groove pine. There was no door. No hallway. No closet. There was nowhere for anyone to stand. And as Vance stared closer at the pale intruder, he noticed something even more terrifying about the figure's neck. The neck was completely straight, unnaturally, impossibly straight, with no visible dip for a collarbone or curve toward the shoulders. It simply vanished straight down into the shadow behind Arthur's armchair, as though the head were floating on a pale, featureless pillar. Vance adjusted the focus knob on the magnifier, forcing his breath to stay slow and steady. He had spent 30 years developing film, handling silver halide emulsion, and staring into the grain of other people's lives. He knew the tricks of light, the ghosts left by double exposures, the strange light leaks that could resemble hands or weeping eyes if a client was grieving enough to see them. But this was not an artifact of chemistry. The grain on the pale cheek matched the grain on Arthur's tweed coat perfectly. The light source hitting the stranger's forehead came from the exact same angle as the overhead chandelier. The entity, whatever it was, had been present in the room when the shutter clicked. A sudden, sharp rap on the glass of the studio front door made Vance jump, his knee slamming into the underside of the heavy wooden darkroom table. He froze. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, its pendulum slicing through the heavy smell of fixer and stop bath. It was well past 9 o'clock. The main street outside was dark, the shop shutters long drawn against the damp autumn chill. Vance stepped out of the darkroom, wiping his hands on his canvas apron. He walked into the dim retail front, where the streetlights cast long, amber ribs across the hardwood floor. Standing on the sidewalk outside, peering through the glass with hands cupped around his eyes, was a man in a dark overcoat. Vance unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open a few inches, leaving the heavy brass chain engaged. "We're closed, friend. Come back at 9 tomorrow." The man took a step back, pulling down the collar of his coat. His skin was stark white in the sodium light, his jaw square and set, but his eyes were bright with a frantic, unblinking energy. Vance recognized him instantly, though he had aged 10 years in the span of 6 months. It was Arthur's younger brother, Julian Miller. "Vance," Julian whispered, his voice ragged, as if he had been running. "You have the plate. I know you have it. Arthur told me you were developing the family portrait tonight." Vance hesitated, his hand lingering on the brass chain. "Julian, it's late. The prints aren't dry. You can pick them up with your brother in the morning." "Arthur isn't coming in the morning," Julian said, leaning closer to the crack in the door. The smell of cold rain and stale tobacco rolled off him. "Arthur left the house an hour ago. He didn't take his coat, Vance. He didn't take his boots. He just stood up from the dinner table, walked out the back door into the woods, and stopped answering when we called." A cold spike of dread settled in Vance's chest. "What are you talking about?" "The photo," Julian hissed, his eyes darting down the dark street before locking back onto Vance. "He knew what was in it before you even processed it. He said he felt it standing behind his chair while you were adjusting the tripod. He said he could feel a cold draft on the back of his neck, but he was too afraid to turn around." "Let me in, Vance. Please." Vance unhooked the chain and pulled the door open. Julian slipped inside immediately, his wet boots squeaking against the floorboards. Without waiting for an invitation, he marched straight toward the back room, driven by a panicked familiarity with the shop. Vance followed him into the amber glow of the safe light. Julian leaned over the tray where the fresh print floated in the chemical bath, his face illuminated from below in a ghastly orange hue. He didn't look at his father sitting proudly in the center, nor at his mother's practiced smile. His eyes went directly over Arthur's left shoulder. When Julian saw the face, the narrow eyes, the toothless open mouth, the smooth, column-like neck, all the color drained from his lips. He didn't gasp. He didn't cry out. He simply reached out a trembling finger, hovering an inch above the wet photo paper. "It's closer," Julian whispered. Vance frowned, stepping up beside him. "What do you mean closer?" "It's a static image, Julian. I pulled the glass plate out of the camera 2 hours ago. No, Julian said. No, Julian said, his voice dropping into a register Vance had never heard before, flat, hollow, and utterly devoid of color. Look at the edge of my father's jacket. Yesterday, when we hung this plate in the wash, the face was behind the third birch tree. It was just an outline in the grain, barely a silver smudge. Now look. Vance leaned over the copper tray, the pungent stench of acetic acid and iron sulfate pricking the back of his throat. He brought his magnifying loupe to his eye, pressing the rim against his brow until the metal burned cold. The glass plate beneath the amber light was a mirrored landscape of dark silver tones and chalky highlights. There stood the Montgomery family, Arthur, rigid in his wool frock coat, Clara, her eyes fixed on some distant, invisible point beyond the lens, and young Julian, sitting on the iron bench with his small hands folded neatly in his lap. And then there was the fourth figure. Vance's pulse thudded behind his temples. The shape was no longer a vague trick of light, nor an emulsion flaw caused by a speck of dust on the collodion. It was the distinct, pale curve of a cheekbone, a wetly glistening lip, and a single, dark eye staring directly out of the shadowy crease between Arthur's shoulder and the trunk of the birch tree. But Julian was right. The edge of the stranger's face was no longer obscured by the heavy wool of Arthur's coat. It had shifted forward by a fraction of an inch, overlapping the weave of the fabric, casting a delicate, impossible shadow onto Arthur's shoulder. That's a double exposure, Vance said, though his own voice sounded thin and unconvincing in the quiet darkroom. The silver iodide must have degraded unevenly. You brought a second plate into the bath, or I didn't clear the glass properly before we coated it. We scraped this plate ourselves, Vance. We polished it with rotten stone and alcohol until you could see your reflection in the glass. Julian turned his head, his dark eyes wide and fixed on the red-tinted darkness of the room's far corner. And double exposures don't crawl. Silence stretched between them, heavy and thick with the chemical haze. The red safety lamp flickered once, the oil flame sputtering in its brass housing, casting long, liquid shadows that stretched across the drying racks and the stoneware jars. We strip it, Vance barked suddenly, reaching for the bottle of cyanide-fixing solution. We scrape the collodion off the glass, throw it in the scrap bin, and pour a fresh batch. We tell your father the light failed. We tell him the bath was stale. If we destroy it, it doesn't go away, Julian murmured. He didn't move to stop Vance, but his gaze remained glued to the tray. When I was sitting on that bench, while you were under the black cloth counting off the seconds, I felt a breath on the back of my neck. I thought it was the wind through the leaves. But there was no wind, Vance. The leaves were still. Look at the photo. Vance paused, the heavy stopper of the cyanide bottle held halfway out of its glass neck. Slowly, he lowered the loupe back to the glass. Julian was right again. The leaves of the birch tree were razor-sharp, captured in absolute stillness during the 8-second exposure. But the hair on Arthur's collar, and the long, dark fringe hanging over the extra face, was blurred, smeared as if caught in a localized gale. A sudden, sharp knock rattled the heavy oak door of the darkroom. Both men jumped. Vance nearly dropped the glass stopper, catching it against his chest with a wet snap. Julian. Arthur Montgomery's deep, baritone voice drifted through the thick wood, muffled but unmistakably stern. Vance? Is the plate developed? The rain is starting, and the carriage is waiting. Your mother wants to see the proof before we depart. Julian looked up at Vance, the red ambient light making the sweat on his forehead look like droplets of dark wine. Don't open it, Julian whispered. We have to, Vance muttered back, though his hand trembled as he set the bottle down. Julian grabbed Vance's sleeve, his knuckles white against the dark wool. You don't understand, Vance. I tried to scratch it out while it was still wet in the tray. I used the corner of my scraping tool. The glass wouldn't take the mark. It was as if I were pressing against iron. Vance ignored him, pulling his forearm free with a sharp tug. He slid 2 fingers into the neck of the bath, feeling around the slick, chemical-soaked glass until his tips brushed the heavy, rigid edge of the plate. The silver nitrate left a bitter, metallic tang in the damp air of the room, sharp enough to coat the back of his throat. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, he lifted the wet glass from the bottom of the tray. Dark liquid ran off the edges in heavy ribbons, splashing into the solution below with a sound like dripping fat. "Bring the lamp," Vance said. His voice was too flat, stripped of its usual boom. Julian didn't move at first. He stood transfixed by the dark rectangular silhouette hanging between Vance's fingers. But the sharp rap of a whip against the exterior brickwork, the coachman growing impatient in the downpour, jolted him back to life. He snatched the small kerosene lamp from the wall hook, turning the brass wick key until the flame sputtered into a bright, hot yellow, casting long, jumping shadows across the drying racks. He held the light close. Vance turned the glass plate so the light passed through the milky negative. The image was inverse, a ghostly world of charcoal skin and stark white clothes. There was Lord Harrington, seated tall and rigid in his high-backed carved chair, his silver pocket watch chain gleaming like a streak of white lightning across his vest. To his right, Lady Eleanor, her lace collar rendered as a delicate, web-like frost around her throat. Between them stood young Thomas, his hand resting dutifully on his father's knee. Everything was sharp, precise, impeccably framed, the hallmark of the finest studio in the district. And then there was the space behind Thomas's left shoulder. In the original framing, that space had been filled by the deep, folded velvet of the dark backdrop curtain. Now, the velvet appeared pushed aside, warped as though something dense was leaning through it from behind. Emerging from the darkness, positioned just above the boy's ear, was a face. It was not a blur caused by a long exposure or a stray reflection. The details were unnaturally crisp. The skin was unnaturally pale, stretched so tight across the cheekbones that the jaw looked skeletal. The eyes were wide, unblinking circles of pale gray, staring not at the camera lens, but directly sideways, looking down into the crown of young Thomas's head with an expression of hungry, patient focus. Most horrifying of all was the mouth. It was open in a wide, silent oval, the lips drawn back to reveal teeth that were far too small, far too numerous, crowded together like rows of tiny pale pins. That isn't a double exposure," Vance breathed, his thumb hovering less than a millimeter from the glass. "A double exposure leaves ghosting. Translucency. You can see through the dark tones. This is solid. It's taking up physical density in the emulsion." "Look at the hand," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. He pointed a trembling finger at the glass. Vance raised the lamp higher, bringing the glass within an inch of his nose. Emerging from beneath the velvet drape, resting lightly on the velvet lapel of Thomas's coat, was a hand. The fingers were impossibly long, featuring 3 distinct knuckles each, ending in flat, blackened nails that dug subtly into the fabric. Where the fingers pressed against the wool, the cloth showed small, visible indentations, the clear, physical impression of weight being applied. A sudden, thunderous bang echoed up the narrow wooden stairs, making both men jump. The heavy brass knocker on the street door was being pounded with furious, rhythmic force. "Vance!" Lady Harrington's voice cut through the floorboards from the foyer below, muffled by the timber but sharp with aristocratic fury. "We are losing the evening light. Bring down the glass this instant, or I shall have my footmen clear this damp parlor myself." Vance looked at Julian. The terror in the younger man's eyes was absolute, a stark white reflection of the lamp flame. "We break it," Julian pleaded, reaching for the edge of the plate. "We tell them the glass cracked in the developer. We take the loss. We refund the deposit. And what happens when they ask to see the shards?" Vance countered, stepping back out of reach. "Harrington isn't a fool. He knows glass doesn't shatter in a flat tray without force. If he suspects we ruined his family portrait out of incompetence, he'll have the magistrate close us down by morning." "He won't have to," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave as he gestured toward the velvet-draped table. "Look at it. Vance turned, his lantern swinging a frantic arc across the dark room. The light washed over the silver tray. The plate hadn't shattered into jagged shards as a normal piece of glass would under pressure. Instead, the surface was webbed with fine, perfectly geometric fractures, concentric circles rippling outward from the empty space beside Lord Harrington's shoulder, like a stone dropped into a basin of frozen water. And in the very center of that spiderweb of cracked glass, the pale, blurred oval of the uninvited face was no longer pale, nor was it blurred. It had sharpened. While the surrounding image of the Harrington family remained frozen in dark monochrome, the extra face now bore color, a sickening, bruised violet hue around the hollow sockets where eyes should have been, and a thin, wet crimson sliver where the lips parted. It was small, no larger than a thumbprint, but every line of its features was rendered in microscopic, terrifying detail. The skin looked damp. The mouth was stretched into a soundless, yawning oval, framed by faint, needle-like teeth that hadn't been visible on the original glass negative. "It's not an emulsion error," Vance whispered, forgetting his anger as he leaned over the tray. The chemical stench was changing, shifting from the familiar bite of acetic acid to something thick, sweet, and metallic, like pennyroyal mixed with stagnant river water. "Arthur, tell me you see that. The silver isn't lifting. It's deepening." "Step away from it," Arthur commanded, grabbing a heavy leather apron off the workbench and hurling it over the tray. The moment the dark leather touched the silver plate, a muffled, wet thump echoed through the basement, the distinct sound of a heavy book dropping onto a carpeted floor. Both men froze. The leather apron didn't settle flat. In the middle of the tray, directly above the fractures, the heavy hide bulged upward, rising an inch, then two, as if something underneath were exhaling a slow, ragged breath. "Vance," Arthur breathed, backing toward the wooden stairs that led up to the shop floor. "Get the saltpetre. Get the lime. Lime won't stop a reaction like that, Arthur, that's an organic. Get the damned lime." Vance scrambled toward the chemical shelves, his boots skidding on the damp flagstones. His hands shook so violently that he knocked over a jar of dried collodion, sending a cloud of gray powder into the air. He snatched the heavy earthenware jug of quicklime from the bottom shelf, but as he turned back toward the table, the lantern on the central pillar began to flicker rapidly. The light didn't die from lack of oil, the flame shrank into a tiny, hard bead of brilliant blue, casting long, unnatural shadows upward toward the rafter beams. Underneath the leather apron, the bulging shape shifted. It didn't just rise, it moved sideways, dragging the heavy hide across the tray with a dry, scraping rasp. The sound of cracking glass continued, slow and methodical, like thin ice breaking under a heavy, creeping weight. Snap! 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 Arthur reached for the iron tongs hanging beside the darkroom curtain, his knuckles white. Whatever Harrington brought into this house, it wasn't just a plate. The silver was an anchor, Vance. The developer didn't reveal a photograph, it fed it. A sudden, sharp tug pulled the leather apron completely off the tray, dragging it into the shadows beneath the workbench as if snatched by an unseen hand. Vance dropped the jug of lime. It shattered on the stone floor, spilling white dust over his boots. There on the tray, the glass plate was entirely gone, pulverized into a glowing pile of silvery dust. Standing in the center of the liquid developer, rising directly out of the shallow tray like a reed growing from a pond, was a thin, pale stalk of wet, gray flesh, capped by a miniature, twitching head. Its hollow, violet sockets rolled upward, fixing instantly on Vance's face, and its tiny, crimson mouth opened to emit a faint, high-pitched hiss that sounded unmistakably like a child inhaling after a long dive underwater. The flash of the camera faded, leaving only the dull hum of the flickering fluorescent light and the acrid smell of old paper in the archive room. Arthur stared at the freshly developed print resting on the stainless steel tray, his breath catching in his throat. Beside him, Clara pressed her knuckles to her lips, suppressing a gasp. There, standing just behind Arthur's shoulder in the 1984 portrait of the Vance family, was a face that had not been present when the shutter clicked 40 years ago, nor when they had examined the film under the magnifying glass 10 minutes prior. It wasn't a smudge or a light leak. The features were agonizingly distinct: grayed, papery skin stretched tight over an asymmetrical jaw, eyes swallowed by void-like sockets, and a thin, toothless mouth curled into a knowing, asymmetrical grin. Most terrifying of all, the figure was wearing the exact same wool sweater Arthur had put on that very morning. "Arthur," Clara whispered, her voice trembling like a dry leaf in the wind. "Look at the hands." He forced his gaze downward. Pale, elongated fingers were draped casually over Arthur's adolescent shoulder in the photograph. But as he watched, a cold, prickling sensation spread across the back of his own neck. The weight was physical. The air in the room plunged in temperature, the moisture of their breath blooming into sudden white clouds. The faint scent of wet earth and ozone filled the confined space. Slowly, without making a sound, Arthur turned his head toward the dark corner of the room behind him. The shadow between the metal filing cabinets was thicker than it should have been. It pulsed with a rhythmic, quiet breathing. The grin from the photograph was there in the darkness, gleaming faintly in the dying amber light of the safe light. It was not an intruder. It was a reflection of something that had been waiting inside the frame, biding its time until the light brought it fully into the physical world. The extra face had never belonged to a long-lost relative or a forgotten ghost. It was an entity that fed on captured moments, moving from photograph to photograph, slowly crawling forward through decades of family albums until it finally reached the present. Clara backed away, knocking over a chemical bottle that shattered against the concrete floor, splashing developer fluid across their shoes. The thing step by step detached itself from the corner, leaning forward into the pale red light. It didn't walk, it unfolded, its limbs lengthening with the dry, cracking sound of breaking timber. Arthur tried to scream, but the cold air locked his lungs. He looked back down at the photographic paper in the tray. The image was changing again in real time. The young Arthur in the 1984 photo was gone, replaced by an empty space. The extra face had taken his place in the past, rewriting the family history frame by frame, erasing him from the memory of the living as it stepped out to inherit his present. The entity reached out a long, pale hand, resting its icy fingers onto Arthur's shoulder, exactly where they had been positioned in the photograph. As the world around Arthur dissolved into static and dark silver halide crystals, he felt his consciousness being pulled backward through time, sucked through the narrow glass lens of a camera that had snapped shut decades before.